So thank you for devoting a little bit of time on your Wednesday evening to this webinar. Basically, I wanted to give a talk this month about the cure for burnout that no one taught you. And this is based on my experience with burnout and also coming out of burnout and how I'm really approaching that. Obviously, some of that is going to tie into Cereus Real Estate, which is the sponsor for this talk and also the company that I started. I'm active on social media as a physician and investor, and I talk about a variety of things and about medicine, about investing. And a few years ago, I developed a fairly large TikTok following for some of the things that I was talking about, I think related to medicine and finance in particular. So I'm going to talk all about that. So again, thank you for signing on. So basically, I might as well get started. A lot of the first few slides are kind of like preamble for what I'm going to be talking about. Unfortunately, the people on TikTok are not going to be able to see the slides, but if you sign on at a good time and find the talk useful, hopefully that's a good thing here. All right, so let's get started. So basically, my name is Daniel Shin. I'm a physician. I'm a surgeon who specializes in urologic surgery, and I'm also a real estate investor. Over the last decade, I've been out on social media under the name The Darwinian Doctor. There's a backstory to that I can go into at some other time, but my basic premise is that it's incumbent on us to always be improving ourselves in our personal lives, professional lives, always trying to seek a better state of being. So that's where that name came from. I also am the founder of Cereus Real Estate, which is a real estate investing company that I started last year. I'll talk all about that towards the end because it really does tie into today's topic of burnout. Via Cereus Real Estate and also my own investing over the years, I'm an active and passive investor in over 1,000 units of real estate. So that's who I am. Here is a quick disclaimer. You can read that in your spare time, but basically seek your own advice about anything I talk about. Consider this educational and for entertainment. So, every month for Cereus Real Estate, I like to give a presentation. And these are, generally we'll call them happy hours because I want it to be casual. I want it to be sort of a conversation that is both useful and also fun. But, I wanted to talk specifically about burnout this month because it's very near and dear to my heart. I've gone through it and I know how common it is in basically all professions. I'm going to show some statistics on that. And the thing about burnout is that we just kind of accept it as a normal standard state in a lot of our professional careers. And it can be really damaging. So I'll talk about that. But what is burnout? The World Health Organization defines it as a syndrome resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. What does that mean? Chronic workplace stress. So it has a few components that are generally recognized. And honestly, the definition of burnout, different organizations will have different definitions, and it can mean something very different to you too. But I think these are fairly common characteristics if someone feels burnt out. It's this combination of emotional exhaustion, physical fatigue, cognitive impairment, reduced motivation, and cynicism. So what does that look like to other people? So if you're burnt out and your colleagues are kind of regarding you and interacting with you on a daily basis, they're probably going to see these things. Basically, this syndrome. They're going to feel like, wow, that person's really low energy. I feel very distant from them. They're being very cynical about their job or the day-to-day. And also, your boss might feel, wow, this person is not performing to the level that I sort of expected. What is going on? So there are obviously a lot of contributors to burnout. I'm going to focus in on a few of these things as it relates to our story here. But honestly, one of the biggest contributors to burnout is lack of autonomy. I'm going to define that and talk about how that's important. A lot of this is unmanageable workload. A lot of physicians can think back to COVID when for many specialties, all of a sudden a very manageable, predictable schedule became absolutely insane. ER physicians were on the front lines of this, pulmonologists and critical care physicians also. And also a lot of different other specialties, especially during COVID, if you're in the medical field, got pulled into this really strange world where all of a sudden you might be a gastroenterologist or urologist and you were rounding on the COVID wards trying to talk to patients about their steroid dosing or just helping out the critical care docs that were really crippled by the crazy change in their lives as a result of the COVID population. Other common contributors to burnout, and you might be seeing this in your day to day. You work so hard, but there's just not the recognition there. Or you're working really hard at the top of your game, and because you're doing so well, you don't get the support that you deserve. And, it might be something where you could use a scribe or you could use an assistant, but because you are doing so well, because that's in your nature, they say, you know what, you don't need it. And things like that, situations like that can commonly contribute to burnout. So another thing, unclear job expectations. It might be something where you are in a role where you're just asked to go, but there's very unclear guardrails. There's very unclear ways and paths to success in your role or your job. And also, this kind of is related, but it could be a toxic work environment. So maybe your boss is unreasonable. Maybe your colleagues are not supportive, and maybe the help that you have is just not up to par. So there's a lot of contributors that could be contributing to this syndrome of burnout. So why is it a crisis? So, I feel especially in medicine, we hear a lot about burnout, about how, so many people were burnt out during COVID. And honestly, it's gotten better. So it was recently celebrated in a lot of the medical journals, the fact that burnout rates in medicine amongst physicians and specifically has fallen below 50%. So first of all, that's just crazy. The fact that we're celebrating the fact that only 45% or roughly half of our profession is burnt out. But if you look at it across these other professions, and certainly there are lawyers, dentists, and pharmacists and engineers, for example, within Cereus Real Estate as investors, we're talking about burnout rates across the board in professional fields that are around 50%. Law is right around 50%. Dentistry, 4 to 5 out of 10 dentists are also burnt out. Pharmacists, and this surprised me, but maybe it shouldn't have, pharmacists as a whole are incredibly burnt out. So I think, if you had any illness out there and you said roughly half of the population is suffering from this illness, you would say that this is an epidemic. It is a serious problem. And I think it is a serious problem. Why is it a problem? And let's focus in on autonomy, actually. So I focus in on this because I think in my personal story, which I'm going to get into, I think this was one of the core drivers of burnout for me as a physician. So the lack of autonomy is a big problem if you're in a situation that does not support you. So what is it? First of all, autonomy is the degree of freedom, independence, and discretion allowed to an employee in scheduling their work and determining the procedures used to complete it. So, wow, that seems like kind of a complex definition, but let's just break it down in a simple manner. It's basically how much control you can exert over your environment and your day-to-day as an employee. And you'll note that it is kind of highlighted here that it's something that is specific to being an employee, because if you are the boss, you generally have a very high level of autonomy. So the lack of autonomy is generally not as much of a problem if you're the CEO or if you're the chairman, okay? So the lack of freedom, independence, and discretion can be a lack of autonomy. So the problem that we face as professionals today is that the modern world where professionals are employed is incompatible with autonomy. So basically, if you're an employee, you're in an organization where there are rules, where there are protocols, and the ability of you to just kind of dictate your day-to-day and sort of do whatever you want, that oftentimes just doesn't work when you're in an organization. And that could be in an office of 5 people, or it could be an organization of 5,000 people. So generally, the trick of being in an organization is trying to figure out how you can exert autonomy in your day-to-day while still abiding by the general guidelines and structure of your employment. This is very difficult. So To illustrate that a little bit more, let me just talk to you about who I am. So again, my name is Daniel Shin. Some of the people on this call who've signed up for the webinar are already within Cereus Real Estate and have been for a while. So you might have seen this slide before, but a lot of the people who are on the call are new, are basically signing up just to hear this webinar. So let me introduce myself. My story is that I'm originally a New Yorker. So a lot of interesting news out of New York over the last 24 hours. But when I was growing up in New York, I was very young. We moved out of there when I was just 3 years old. But the bottom line is my parents were first generation Korean immigrants. And when I was growing up, there was no personal finance education that was given to me. That's because my parents didn't really know it. And it's something that I think especially some people who are in the worlds of personal finance or have done a lot of self-education about it, they take it for granted that people should just know about things like interest and compound interest and wealth and, how you generate wealth. But the fact is, it's not taught in schools for the most part. I remember home economics when I was young, but we were literally being taught how to, make soup and, bathe ourselves. It wasn't anything about how to actually attain financial freedom or generate wealth. And that's really the standard in our country. In my family when I was young, there was tons of financial stress. So I have immense respect for my parents. They did an incredible job raising me, I think, and they did the best they could. But unfortunately, along the way in my childhood, we faced problems with job loss in my parents. And when I was in middle school, we were evicted from our home, and very quickly over the course of one weekend, had to load up everything into a U-Haul and ship it across the town to a rental home. Things like that leave financial scars. So even now, I have a lot of problems with finding that balance between saving money and spending money and just feeling secure financially. So I think the solution that a lot of people end up with, especially in immigrant populations, is focusing on education. So, perhaps this is less and less true, probably beyond the scope of this talk, but certainly back when I was a child, it was imparted to me by my parents that the best, most secure way of raising our socioeconomic class was through education. And I really took that to heart. Luckily, I did well in school, and I really did commit myself to educational excellence. So I graduated valedictorian in my high school. I went to Yale University for undergraduate. I went to the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine for medical school and got into a competitive specialty in urology. And I did that residency at USC in Los Angeles. And I joined Kaiser for a lot of different reasons. But one of them was that I thought it was a well-run organization that has a good mission, and I was going to get a good paycheck. So that was my solution and my path out of the financial instability of my childhood. So obviously, this process took quite a long time, 15 years plus, right? If you're counting college maybe. So by the time I got through this process, though, I was a urologic surgeon employed by Kaiser Permanente in Southern California. And you would have thought, from the exterior that my family was living the dream because I had a great paycheck. After the first couple of years when they lowball you, your paycheck does rise within Kaiser Permanente. And after a few years, we had certainly a very good income. I was married. We had 2 kids. I literally had this house that was pictured here. It's in Los Angeles. This was a very nice house. It had a bunch of bedrooms and bathrooms. We had a garden in the back, a pool, and I had this car up here. It's a little blurry, but it was a Tesla Model 3. I was driving my shiny Tesla around Southern California. We were part of a beach club, which was awesome, and our kids were in private school. They were young, so they were essentially in very expensive daycare, but they were in private school, right? So if you put all of these bullet points down and just look at them sort of under the microscope, you would say, this person is doing amazing. This is the American dream, right? The problem that I have, or that I had back then, my problem was that I was massively burnt out. I had massive burnout. And I found this really, really puzzling because I was only a few years into my practice as an attending physician, but I was absolutely massively burnt out. So why did I feel that way? These were some of the contributors. So if you peel back the shiny surface of that American dream, you saw that I had a 10 to 15 hour weekly commute. And obviously, that's not every single day, but if you added together all the time that I spent driving in my car to and from work, it was probably 10 to 15 hours. I worked in Orange County and I lived in Los Angeles. So that was an hour back and forth. And sometimes I was covering the hospital down in Irvine. So if you know Southern California, those are very long distances and distances that you're driving in this type of traffic. I believe that is a photo of the 405 freeway in Southern California. So I was spending a soul-crushing amount of time in my car, just getting back and forth to work. I was also working 50 or 60 hours a week. And that's normal for physicians, by the way. I know many other professionals work even more than that, but it was reliably 50 or 60 hours a week. That was a combination of clinic, of surgical days, and being on call. And when I was on call, it was exhausting. Our hospital had an encatchment area of over 500,000 people, 600,000 plus. So if you're on call, you were busy. You were seeing consults in the ER, and you were lucky if you got to sleep a little bit that night. So that was being on call. And then on the regularly scheduled days in clinic, and I'm sure physicians on this call can relate, there was endless pressure to see more and more patients in clinic because the more, I was salaried, right? But the more patients that I saw in my salaried time, the better financial impact I was having on the hospital, on Kaiser, essentially. So there were a lot of metrics that we had to meet, not only about production in terms of how many patients we were seeing per hour, but also satisfaction metrics. So it wasn't enough that you were seeing patients very quickly in clinic. Generally I had about 15 minutes a patient, but they also had to be really happy about the 15 minutes that I spent with them. So, if the average patient satisfaction scores fell below a certain amount, I would get called into the office with my chief, and I'd have to go over certain complaints and be like, okay, so what are we going to do about this? How are we going to make these patients happy? So, arguably that's a good thing for patients, but it was taken to an extreme in a lot of ways that honestly, was very, very wearying. So on top of this, I hardly saw my kids. So as I said, I had two boys. At the time, they were very young. And the bottom line is that I would get up and leave for work before they got out of bed in the morning, because I was, out the door by 6 o'clock. And I got home most days right around the time when they were going to bed. So, if I was lucky, I would be able to give them a hug and say goodnight. But on any day that I was delayed for any reason, for example, I had a few extra, charts to close that night, or certainly if I was on call, I was not seeing my kids. I was lucky to see them on the weekends. And at the very bottom there, this is a problem with our medical education system in this country, but I had literally $300,000 of debt. It started out at $200K after med school, and then I put it in forbearance during residency, so it ballooned to $300K by the time I graduated residency. Now, I think, compared to some of the debt that some people have now, that was chump change. But at the time, it felt like an insurmountable amount of debt. And it was always in the background, kind of putting this pressure on me. And to top it off, I was paying probably about 35 to 40% of every dollar I made to either California or the federal government. There was a very high tax burden, especially in California. So you put all this together, and I was really suffering from burnout just a few years into my practice as an attending physician. You're probably identifying and nodding your head to a lot of these things, especially if you're on this call. So I would say out of all those things, one of the major issues, like probably individually, I could have dealt with that if I had a lot of control over my schedule, but I didn't. I had a major lack of autonomy. And, I think this is really common in physicians these days because different than 20 or 30 years ago, most of us are employees now. It's over 70%. That number flipped during COVID, where before COVID, I believe we were about 50-50, but now certainly we are over 50%. The majority of us are employees. And when you're an employee, as we discussed earlier, you do not have much autonomy. So I had very little control over my schedule. When I started out at Kaiser, I had significantly less vacation days than my wife did. So we'd run into this awkward situation where, she wanted to go on vacation and I said, "I'm sorry, I don't have enough vacation days." So she would just, waste vacation days just, around the house and things like that. But we couldn't go on as much vacation as I wanted. As I said, I hardly saw my kids, let alone was able to see their singing events or whatever, parent teacher conferences. I couldn't do any of that, right? And we had 14 urologists in my department, and trying to juggle that schedule was a nightmare. So if we wanted to go on vacation as a family, I had to put in that request a year in advance. And if you wanted to make any, you can't make last minute changes without trading with someone else. So it was this scheduling nightmare. And also, as I mentioned, I could not control my workload. The productivity targets were set by the department, by Kaiser. And, if I wasn't hitting them, it was a problem. Finally, to top it off, and people make skits about this, especially on TikTok, but I had to do all these wellness modules, and it was mandatory. If you did not do your wellness modules, you started getting these notifications, email notifications, and then eventually you would get in big trouble, and essentially you'd have to do them, right? And also, I was an employee. I had no control over my staff. So even if I had the worst assistant in the world, I could tell my chief about it, but I could not fire them. I had to deal with it. And finally, due to, job openings and things like that, I could not move my work location closer to my home. So I felt very trapped by that commute. I saw no way out. So what happened as a result of my burnout? I think I was all of these things when I was burnt out. I was a bad father because I wasn't seeing my kids. I wasn't contributing to raising them. And when I was around, I was tired, grumpy, angry, frustrated, all of the things that you feel when you're feeling burnt out. I was not in a space to be a good father. I think, my wife might disagree with this, but I think I certainly was a bad husband. I wasn't supporting her to the extent that I wanted to. And I was certainly not as good of a doctor as I could have been when I was feeling really burnt out. I pride myself generally for having a high standard of doing things, and certainly I was doing the best I could. But when I was feeling the most burnt out, I was not very nice to all of my patients. I had a much lower tolerance to listening to stories that were irrelevant to the medical care. So I'd cut them short, and I was just trying to get through the day, right? So I think as a result of my burnout, I was just failing in all the tenets and all the things that I wanted to be doing in life. And you might identify with this. So enough about it. Let's figure out some solutions, okay? We're almost halfway through the hour, so I want to turn to solutions before we run out of time. So I ran experiments. I am someone who basically, eventually I tire of bad situations and I try to fix them. So I ran a number of experiments. This car, the Tesla Model 3, was an experiment because one solution for me that presented itself was saying, okay, you've got 10 or 15 hours a week in the car. Let's get a nice car, and B, let's get one that drives itself. So I stood in line for the Tesla Model 3 because I knew that I was going to have this autopilot feature, right? And I got one. So in 2018, I got a Tesla Model 3, and I did see an improvement in my commute. Did that solve my burnout by itself? It did not, but it was a good try. Experiment number 2, become the boss, right? Because we talked about how autonomy is generally a term that is talked about in reference to employees, because when you're an employee, you just don't have as much control over your day-to-day. Well, a couple of years into COVID, our chief in the department left for private practice. I think he himself was also very burnt out. And I said to myself, hey, I thought I could do a good job as chief of the department. And then secondly, I said, I'm probably going to have more control over my day-to-day if I just become chief of the department. So for the last couple of years that I was at Kaiser, I was chief of the department, and I poured everything I had into being a good chief. And I did feel like I had a bit more control. What they don't tell you about being chief of your department in an organization like Kaiser is that when you're a normal urologist, say in the department, you have one boss, and that's your chief. when you are chief of the department, you have like 12 bosses. And I kid you not, all of a sudden I had gained many, many bosses. So who did I have? I had the surgical service line director became my boss. The chief medical officer of that Orange County became my boss. I had a regional chief that I had to worry about. I was answering to so many more people when I became the quote boss of my department. So I would call this a good try, but also a failure. I also tried to push the limits, and this is actually something that I think you can do wherever you are in your profession or your role as an employee. You can push the limits. So a lot of what I felt was constraining me, actually, some of it was just in my head. So I decided that on certain days I was going to end my clinic a couple hours early, just so I would have the opportunity to try to get home to see my kids. I really hesitated about that decision, and when I kind of talked about it and told the scheduler to make it so, it was totally fine. The rest, there were plenty of physicians to see the rest of the patients. My happiness greatly improved, and it didn't create more than a ripple, So I'm going to come back to this at the end because I really think we should talk about this a little bit more. The things that did not work, because I tried a lot of things. Taking expensive vacations did not work. Were the expensive vacations nice? Yes, but they increased my financial worries because we're spending a lot of money going to sit on a beach. And the problem with vacations when you're burnt out is that it'll probably take you at least half of the vacation just to start to decompress. And then as soon as you enjoy a little bit of relaxation, you start worrying about going back to work. So literally, we would go to a beach destination. The first few days, I was sort of coming out of my funk. And, by the middle of the week of vacation, I was finally feeling good and smiling and, enjoying myself on the beach. And then I saw the week ending, and I just knew that I would be back in the grind before I knew it. And not only that, I would have a pile of work waiting for me when I returned to my desk. So expensive vacations were nice, but they did not solve the burnout. In fact, I think they only accentuated the burnout because of the contrast between being on vacation and being at work. Another thing that doesn't work is the if only fallacy. If only I make it to the end of the quarter, I'll be fine. If only I make it to my second year, I'll be fine because I'll get a raise and I'll get a promotion. Basically, the if only fallacy does not work because the same intrinsic things that cause your burnout do not generally go away just because you get to year 2 or year 3 of employment. I do think this is true for residency training because once you graduate residency training, things do get much better. But aside from that, I think the if only fallacy just does not work when you're an employee because there are no general, benchmarks. The only caveat might be, and my lawyer friends could, criticize this potentially, but maybe once you become a partner in a law firm, But I've also heard that when you become a partner, you're working even harder because the financial stability of the firm is on your shoulders. Finally, self-medication did not work. There's only so much coffee you can drink in a day to try to get that pep back, At the worst of my caffeine addiction, I'm still addicted to caffeine, for sure. But at the worst of the caffeine addiction, I was probably drinking literally like 10 cups of coffee a day. And they were the bad sort of coffee pods from the Keurig machine. I developed horrible gastroesophageal reflux disease, which I still suffer from. And it just stopped working. I would be literally chugging a cup of coffee at 6 or 7 p.m. just so I would not fall asleep and crash on the way home. So obviously when you're just exhausted by your day to day, there's only so much you can self-medicate. And if you're, unfortunately, if you're self-medicating with alcohol at night, that just makes your next day harder. So self-medication does not work. So let's pivot because I really think that financial freedom is the only true way to get to full autonomy. What do I mean by full autonomy? Just full control over your day-to-day. And you might say, of course that's true, right? Because if you don't need money, you don't have to work. You can really control everything about your day-to-day. So this might be self-evident, but I don't think people really regard this as something that's achievable. On TikTok, it might be a random audience, but on the webinar, it is certainly a self-selected audience of high-income professionals. That's just who you are, right? So you can get there. Let's talk about the ways to do it though. So what is financial freedom? Let's just define that. Financial freedom is basically when your passive income is greater than your expenses. That is basically it. You can argue about the semantics, but basically when your assets or your money and your investments are making more than you spend, you are financially free. So, and this, I think you might find this self-evident, right? You might find it self-evident that if you are financially free, you have autonomy. That might be very obvious to you. You might be kind of feeling frustrated at that truism, but I think this is not as well known. And this is what I found myself. This is what I think is kind of a secret. But starting the journey to financial freedom by itself improves the condition of burnout. So basically, on one of those hour-long drives to work, I started learning about financial freedom. I started learning about the ways to get there through investing. And as soon as I started taking action on this, I started to feel better. So that I think is a real secret, because I think people feel that getting to financial freedom is so hard and so far in the future that they don't even think about it, don't even start, because they think, how is something that is going to happen years from now going to help me in my day-to-day? And my message to you, and the secret, is that when you start taking action to financial freedom, and even better, when you start attaining some level of passive income, that by itself will make you feel immeasurably better, because you are changing the circumstances. As soon as you start, you'll feel incredibly better. So how do you attain financial freedom? Obviously there's a million ways, but the three main ways that you are going to encounter on your way to financial freedom are these three. You can invest in the stock market, you can invest in real estate, or you can start a business. And people do this every day. For the sake of this presentation, I'm going to focus on the first two, because I did both of these specifically. I've done the third one with Cereus Real Estate, but when I was starting my journey, it was really the first two. So let's talk about investing in stocks. So really your goal, if you're investing in stocks with the goal of getting to financial freedom, is you're trying to achieve the 4% rule. So what is that? Basically, the way you do this is you invest into the stock market, and you can do this in a taxable brokerage account. You could do it in retirement accounts. There are a lot of ways you can invest in the stock market. You invest your money into the stock market, you wait, and you take advantage of compound interest, which is interest this year and also interest on the interest you received last year. That compounds and then grows significantly over time. When the value of your stocks is greater than 25 times your expenses, you have achieved financial freedom. So what are these numbers? Why am I saying 25 times? What am I talking about with the 4% rule? Basically, there was a study, it's called the Trinity study, and it demonstrated with a greater than 95% certainty that if you attain a nest egg in the stock market and you only withdraw 4% of that nest egg every year, you will never run out of money, because as you know, stocks generally over history go up by about 8 to 10% a year. So they settled on this mathematical number and they back tested it through history. But basically, if you have money in the stock market and you only take out 4% of the value, that will never go to zero. So if you can live on 4% of your stock portfolio, then you are financially free. That is the basis of this method. What is the problem with that though? It takes a lot of time and investment. So if you're getting about 8% of a return in the stock market by the rule of 72, it's going to take about 9 years for your money to double. So it just takes a lot of time for this process to happen. That being said, it is math. And even considering all of the crashes of history, generally it recovers. And over a long period of time, you will do well if you just invest in the stock market. The other problem that I noted specifically with stock investing is that a lot of the money that I was playing with was locked into retirement accounts. So as you know, retirement accounts cannot be accessed prior to retirement age, which, 59 and a half is basically the number that has been given. Before that, Many people find it hard to think about waiting until essentially 60 years of age to access retirement funds. What do you do if you're burnt out and you're 40 years old, for example? How about, so as a caveat, when I'm talking about investing in stocks, it's generally the fact that you're going to be investing into index funds because index funds are cheap. They are inherently diversified because index funds have a little piece of many, many, many companies in our country. I'm a big fan of index funds. But what about individual stocks? You say Nvidia went up 40% this year. Why can't we just do that? So the problem with individual stocks is that they can be incredibly volatile. Nvidia may be up 40% or 50% or whatever it's doing. It's just insane. It also can crash 20% just because Trump says something about tariffs. So most people, unless you are a stock picking savant, investing in individual stocks can be very risky and very stressful. I invested in individual stocks in my experimentation and I did pretty well. I had, everyone was doing fine at the time, but I had a handful of tech stocks that I invested in, and it grew very quickly and did very well, but it was very stressful. I was spending my lunch breaks scanning and reading investor notes and watching the ticker go up and down. And every time it went up and down, I was feeling pressure, like I was losing wealth. So I found it incredibly stressful to invest in individual stocks. I hardly have any left because I think A, I'm focused on real estate, and B, I just found it incredibly stressful. Quick example of the 4% rule. So if your monthly spending is $10,000, which it's unfortunately probably much higher than that, but that means your annual spending is 120K, you need $3 million of stocks to hit the 4% rule and financial freedom. That's just a quick illustration, okay? Let's pivot to real estate investing because obviously, I started Cereus Real Estate, that's a sponsor of this webinar. Why do I like real estate and why should you? The thing that eventually made me turn my attention mostly to real estate were two things. It generates cash flow, which can offset expenses directly. So instead of having to collect 25 times your expenses with real estate, it generates cash flow, which is cash just getting deposited in your account every month. That can directly offset expenses 1-to-1. So I liked that. It's also really tax advantaged. So I'll spend 1 minute here just talking about this. It could be a 45-minute talk all by itself. But the tax code, contrary to popular belief, the tax code is actually, it's an insight into what the government wants us to be doing with our money. Because the reason, this, of course, it's debatable, but from my perspective, if the government is offering incentives to invest in a certain thing, it's because they want more of that thing in the world or in the US specifically. So businesses are very tax advantaged. They let you deduct things, expenses, etc. It's because businesses, pound for pound, make our economy run. Basically, small businesses provide jobs, they provide employment, they magnify wealth in our country. The same thing goes for real estate. The government does not want to be in the business of directly building all the housing that this country needs. They tried some of that, and that ended up with projects that, for the most part, did not end up providing good quality housing for the long term. A lot of them became sort of low income and very poverty and crime stricken. So nowadays, they support the private real estate industry with tax incentives. So the main way that they do this is through something called depreciation, which is probably something that we can talk about in the future. But suffice it to say, real estate is very tax advantaged. And when you're in a state or country that taxes 40% of every dollar, that's very appealing. So how do we invest in real estate? You could do it through real estate investment trusts, also known as REITs. That's pretty much like stock market investing. You can invest in it passively through real estate funds and syndications like Cereus Real Estate, or you could do it actively. You can do short-term rentals, you can buy duplexes yourself, you could even buy commercial property like retail strips and things like that. What do I like about real estate? You can say this for investing, but there are cycles in real estate, just like there are cycles in the general economy, just like there are cycles in the stock market. There's a lot of debate, for example, where we are in the stock market. Are we going to see a big pullback? Is there going to be a correction? Is there going to be a bear market? You probably heard terms like this. The thing about real estate is that it's such a big industry that there are microcycles within real estate. So what I've been seeing in real estate now is that there's a significant opportunity in apartment complexes. So basically what happened is that around 2022, as we were coming out of the pandemic, the Federal Reserve started increasing interest rates. And they, you know this if you've been reading the news, but they didn't do it just a little bit. They quadrupled interest rates. So, and I know this intimately because I had some variable rate HELOCs at the time. So, you can get a mortgage with a fixed interest rate, or you can get a mortgage with variable rate debt. So if the interest rate from the Federal Reserve goes up, the interest rate on your mortgage goes up. That's variable rate debt. It's risky, but for many, many years since the great financial crisis, interest rates in this country were virtually zero from the Federal Reserve, and you could borrow on HELOC debt at maybe 2% interest rate, 3% interest rate, virtually free. So when I was building my real estate portfolio, I was using some of this to renovate houses and even buy things. They were doing that on a much larger scale with apartment complexes. And when you're dealing with an apartment complex that is $50 million, $100 million, and requires a significant amount of capital every single month to service the debt, if the interest rate ticks up more than a point or two, you can suddenly be 100% screwed. So that happened to a significant level in 2022 to 2023. And what we're seeing now in apartment complexes is a lot of those deals have unfortunately fallen apart. So investors who invested into deals at that time may unfortunately not be getting their money back. And the people running those deals are being forced by the banks to sell them at a significant discount from what they bought them at. I'll give you concrete examples of this later on, but suffice to say, there is a significant opportunity in large apartment complexes in this country right now. With experience and, just watching the cycles very closely, you can recognize this. So Cereus Real Estate is a company that I started at the beginning of last year. We've got over 800 investors in Cereus Real Estate right now. And in just over, we're not even at 2 years yet, but we've invested collectively $5 million of capital into about 900 multifamily real estate units. So these are examples. So this on the left here is the Apollo Heights apartment complex in Garland, Texas. And on the right here, this is the Hampton Meadows, which is an apartment complex in Des Moines, Iowa. And I can put these up here now because, A, you're within the investor club, and B, these deals have concluded. So, a lot of these deals are by law not publicly advertised. So for the people who have signed up for Cereus Real Estate, you're in the club. You're going to get access to deals like this in the future, but I can illustrate them now. After they're concluded, I put them on the website, etc. But so the apartment complex on the left was purchased at a discount of about 30% from the 2022 price. So step back for a second and think about that. I think it's one thing if you're buying a pair of jeans at 30% off. I would be happy about that. Generally, I get excited for any sale over 20%. But when you're talking about a B plus grade, which is good grade apartment complex that you can buy at a 30% discount from a prior sales price, obviously that doesn't get rid of the risk 100%, but it significantly de-risks that investment. So this is happening right now all over the country, because all of those deals that are falling apart from 2022 they're changing hands. The banks, et cetera, are forcing the sales. So there's a significant opportunity right now. And these are the type of deals that I've been getting excited about for Cereus Real Estate. So what do I do in Cereus Real Estate? Basically, we investigate the deal as much as possible. So that includes background checks on the sponsors. I talk to the team. I do third-party underwriting on their pro forma, which is their financial projection. I'll do physical due diligence. I'll fly out to the property. I'll kick the tires. I'll secret shop their leasing office. And basically, my goal is to try to translate the risks and benefits of the deal. Just like I'm explaining a nephrectomy to my patients, I'm trying to translate that so that you can make an informed decision if you'd like to invest in the deal or not. You're in control of your money. You can invest in the deal. You can not invest in the deal. I'm happy either way. And basically, we use our fund structure to negotiate better deal terms. So in Cereus Real Estate, if I have 20 investors in a deal who are putting in capital, I'll put that all into one pot. I'll bring it over to a sponsor who's looking for capital to buy and renovate an apartment complex. And I'll say, I'm bringing you over a significant amount of capital. Let's give me and my investors better terms than if I were coming to you by myself. And in that arbitrage, I can translate and give to you better returns too. So it's kind of like using the leverage of collective investing. This is a very important thing to me, but 10% of all profits from Cereus Real Estate is directed towards a Memphis nonprofit. So I've already set aside some capital from this year, and this year I'll be supporting the Memphis Art Museum. But in this way, I think we can make a really significant impact to the community here locally. And unfortunately, Memphis does need the support. I've been here for a few years now. After moving from Los Angeles, after I quit full-time medicine at Kaiser, I still do work now as a locum tenens about a quarter of the time, but I want to make an impact on the community here. And what are the target returns? So we talked about how you can invest in real estate in a bunch of different ways. I would argue, and this is from my own personal experience, that investing in actively, either in short-term rentals or single-family homes, duplexes, it is very tough to do that, especially as a professional in law, in medicine, in pharmacy. I did it. Before I left Kaiser, I built up a portfolio of almost 30 units of active real estate. And what I had done is essentially created a second job for myself. So I think the reality is that for most professionals, it makes far more sense to place capital through something like Cereus Real Estate into a pre-vetted passive deal. The fact is, the returns that I'm searching for are still quite high. So I'm looking for 15 to 20% annual returns. That's roughly twice as much as you would expect from the stock market in an average year. That means that instead of doubling your money investing in 9 to 10 years, then you can expect to double your money in about a 5 to 7 year time period. So you're significantly accelerating your wealth growth. And also these deals kick off a 5 to 10% cash flow, which, as we said, can directly replace operating costs and expenses in your own life. But what are the problems? So obviously nothing is foolproof. There are risks with everything. And there are some downsides to investing into real estate passively through Cereus Real Estate or any of the other real estate funds or syndicators out there. First of all, you must be accredited. So to invest into a deal with Cereus Real Estate, you must be an accredited investor. So what does that mean? That means that in a given year, you as a single person have to have an income of at least 200K or more. With your spouse, it can be 300K, or your net value, the net worth of your family, has to be more than $1 million, not including your primary home. That's just a definition of accredited investor. The SEC sets that rule because they don't want a single investment leading to financial ruin for the investor. So that's the bar that you have to hit. It's illiquid. So I talk about this a lot in my investor calls, which I hope all of you book, but it's illiquid. So, if you invest into a deal that is supposed to go on for 5 years and you say in year 2, I want my money back, it is stuck. It's essentially very, very difficult. Unless you find someone to buy you out, it's very difficult to pull your money out. So the money that you're investing, expect it to be invested until the deal terminates, usually in years 5 to 7. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not getting cash flow along the way and you're not appreciating, but it means that it's very difficult to suddenly pull money out of these deals. So there is an illiquidity to it that, I think is part of the deal. And finally, minimum investment is high. So you could buy a share of an index fund for $50 or $100, but for deals like this, it does involve a significantly higher financial commitment. So these are downsides. So I talked about this in the Cereus Happy Hour, I think last month or the month prior, but I still invest in equities and stocks. I think that the liquidity that you get in stocks and the reliable, over time, of course, 8 to 10% is still very valuable. So we recently sold an asset in Los Angeles and put 6 figures into the stock market. Now, I might regret that a little bit if the stock market continues to drop and we see a big pullback, but I think over time it'll be fine, right? But I put also an equal amount of my assets into real estate because, again, I really enjoy the cash flow, and I also enjoy the fact that it's has a much higher return potential than your average index fund. So slightly higher risk for significantly higher return. So bringing it back to burnout as we round out the hour, and I think we're just going to hit it on the dot. What's my advice to you? Burnout is unacceptable. It's a significant problem with lots of side effects, as we discussed. Don't accept it as a fact of life. You should act now. I think you can exert more control over your day-to-day than you think. You might feel that it's just impossible for you to have a little bit more control over your schedule when you arrive, when you depart. Try. You might be surprised that most of the obstacles are in your own mind. I found that with my own schedule when I was full-time at Kaiser. Also, of course, start your journey to financial freedom. As we discussed, the only way for true autonomy is if you don't need your job, if you are financially free. And you will get there someday because you're on this talk. I have confidence in that. But you need to start now. You need to intentionally start putting your capital to work towards financial freedom. And you'll find that as soon as you start that, you'll start feeling better about your day-to-day. You'll have less burnout. Thank you so much. I think we did it. I think we're pretty much exactly on time for the webinar. This is going to be, chopped up and edited and released to the Cereus Real Estate Investor list at some point in the future. I recently hired a video editor to help me with all this stuff, but you saw it live, and I know that it was probably much more powerful. You could scan this if you're not already on the investor list. I think all the webinar participants already are. Schedule a call with me. I'd love to talk to you. I'd love to see where you are on your journey. I'd love to talk to you more about how investing in Cereus Real Estate works. And even if you don't invest into a real estate deal now, even if you're not accredited, I love talking to people. I love talking to professionals about their day-to-day. Obviously, I'm not a financial professional, but I've been there. I've been through it. And I would say by many measures, I've sort of achieved my goals, but this is what I love to do. I would be happy if I could work a little bit in medicine and continue to grow Cereus Real Estate for the rest of my life. So I would love to talk to you. Thank you for tuning in today, for giving me an hour of your time on this Wednesday evening. Andrew, Brian, Faith, Hyun, Jeff, Jessica, Joshua, Luke, and the others, thank you very much. All right, talk to you soon. Bye.